Okay, so after lunch, pretty tough spot for a keynote presentation, but I hope the topic is at least interesting to a lot of you. And the first thing that I wanted to see, like, how many of you are running developer programs for IoT? Let me show it. Okay, wow, it's more than I expected. And it's definitely a hot topic in the industry right now. A lot of us definitely think about IoT. We at SAP started about 3-4 years back, like, to work with customers on the IoT programs, but then from a developer outreach, we actually started about a year ago. Before we did not really approach it from an IoT perspective, but we saw like there's more and more interest in the developer community around IoT, and that also then triggered definitely for us, like, okay, how can we really work with these developers? What does these developers need? So today, I apologize if you expect a lot of like wearables and consumer stuff. That's not in our SAP course. I will have more the industry and the logistics stuff, but I hopefully get also some good ideas on like if you approach the consumer space. So IoT, one thing, and when I initially thought about IoT, it was like, okay, where's our hardware? In SAP, we do software for big companies, and I couldn't really figure out like, okay, where do the hardware, the sensors and all this stuff would even fit into our program. And I will dive a little bit deeper later on, like where we see the hardware coming in. But like, that's normally what a lot of us think. Like if you think about IoT programs, hardware, sensors, Raspberry Pis, Arduinos, Edison, Teslas, that's the stuff which normally comes to your mind for a developer program. But there's much more behind IoT, and that's often what we overlook in these programs and where you can focus on with your developer programs. So to define Internet of Things, it's a pretty big area. And like, yes, we have the consumer side of Internet of Things. You see like, definitely like with the Fitbits, now the watches. I don't know how many of you are currently working on the tutorial for the upcoming Apple Watch to get your software exposed through the Apple Watch. I think we're all working on this, if it's a sales data or some consumer stuff. So there's a lot of like definitely triggered by the consumer side. And IoT definitely started out much more from a developer and engagement and also from the partner programs on the consumer side, but it's definitely not only on the consumer side. So other things, it's healthcare. And I always joke, like, there's two types of IoT conferences you currently go. The one is the consumer and healthcare type of IoT conferences, and they only talk about like your Fitbits and your watches and the healthcare and what you can monitor. So it's very much like the end consumer focused IoT. But then there's also the bigger business and industry IoT. And this is often like you find them more in industry conferences, in logistic conferences, in retail conferences, in communications conferences. So just if you think about it, like, yes, you can monitor what's going on in your heart and like really give this back, and the big advantage there is, like, doctors don't only check you for the 5 minutes they see you, they can constantly get the information from the time you're not in the office. And these are the big changes, and that also applies to the business side. Like now think about it, you have a truck and you have a sensor on the truck. I know pretty much like every minute where this truck is, how fast it's going. Most of the trucks have these sensors already built in. It's also, they're connected already. So a lot of things have already happened in the industry, or like sensor data on streets, traffic lights, it's all there. And then of course like retail. Retail is very much interested in going also into IoT. The reason for that is we want to better understand the consumer behavior. And definitely like Amazon and eBay, they did great jobs on like really figuring out how they can interact with you on your web browser. They're much better than any sales clerk out there. But now you can take IoT, and for example, this is smart vending, where we have a big initiative around it, where you definitely also understand much better what the consumer wants when they stand in front of a vending machine. So just think about it. You have a vending machine, you have Cokes in there, you have chips in there, you have some sweets in there. Like with all the information we can collect now, we know much better what a typical consumer wants at 11:30 a.m. before lunch and at 1:30 after lunch. If they order a Coke after lunch, you might want to give them some sweets and you do a promotion to that. So these are like really interesting scenarios which are building up in the IoT space. Another one is, you probably have seen this with iBeacons. You can pretty much like tag everything out there which you find in the store, in the shop. Like the shoes you maybe pick up at Nordstrom, they have an iBeacon on it. Then they know exactly, oh, this shoe was picked up like 15 times. It's probably something we should put into a better shelf space. This is coming across the things, and of course, you cannot do it everywhere right away, but this is exactly the trends we are seeing. And then also like remote maintenance. Like just think about, you have a windmill out in the ocean. How do you maintain this? If something goes wrong, do you each time send out a ship? Can you control this automatically? So there's a lot of like things going on in the consumer and in the business space. So just for a definition, there's another term coming in, and it's more like on the SAP side, Industry 4.0. And basically the definition for it is like the Internet of Things is much more when you interact directly with the consumer. The business interacts with the consumer interacts with your products. And you also want to make the experience with your product better. That's the more and the bigger chunk of IoT. But like what's beneath and what's happening in the industry, how you produce this, how you manufacture, how you change your manufacturing, there's a huge world going on behind it. And that's also a good thing. If you have a business in there, these big companies are spending a lot. And the reason for that is there's a lot of like innovation and they don't want to fall behind. It's global pressure, it's competitiveness. If you think about like lots of like big companies, they're investing a lot in IoT really to be on the front and really innovate ahead of everybody. So just a few examples what developers or like our partners, developers in our ecosystem are building with these customers. So the first one is a business challenge. And this business challenge is shipping a harbor in Europe. And they are restricted because this harbor, it's Hamburg port. They existed since ever. Hamburg port built some roads around it. And the big challenge for them is like we need to scale on the global economy. Like there are more container ships coming in day after day, year after year. So how do we build this out? So right now, they have about 9 million containers coming into the harbor and into the port every year. That's 24,600 containers per day. If you line all these containers up, it's a truck line from San Francisco to Tahoe. So now you think about it like, okay, you have a fixed defined network of roads, railways, and so on. Now the goal for them was, we wanted to ship 25 million container by 2025. So how do you go from 9 million to 25 million container in 15 years or 16 years? No, 10 years. That's now 68,000 containers per day. That would be a road, if you line them up, almost you're reaching Salt Lake City. So the thing is like you're completely restricted by the physical dimensions of your streets, your network and your rail. And that's exactly when they looked into IoT and into sensors. So what they're doing is pretty much like they had a lot of data already available. Traffic information from the road, how fast is the traffic flowing, that was already, they could tap into existing networks. Each truck had already some connectivity built in. Additionally, they gave the drivers and the logistic companies smartphones and tablets with applications on it, which helps them in the routing. The container ships have the sensors on it, and ultimately this allowed them, like by mashing up all this information, to optimize the logistics. And so the project is in place for about 2 years, and they're already like progressing in the pace they expected it. It will be interesting how it goes in the long term, because there's still lots more containers they need to get in and out. But this is exactly like challenges these companies are facing out there. Another one, and that's a little bit a different IoT story, and I really like this one, is it's also like your experience around IoT might be something completely different, or how IoT can help with experience. So maybe, since we all maybe know the situation, you could quickly close your eyes and imagine the last time you went to a public restroom. So what's your experience? Probably not the best one. Now you can close your eyes again. I don't want to leave you too long in the public restroom. But it's exactly like challenges you have when you have to run big events. So here's a soccer stadium. They have 50,000 folks in the stadium. There's the halftime break, and 50,000 go to the restroom. So how do you optimize these challenges? Like, so we worked with one company there where actually all the different dispensers in the restroom, they were already touchless. Next thing what they're currently doing is they IoT enable these dispensers, like soap dispensers, towel dispensers, etc. And then they connected this via wireless to a Raspberry Pi, and the Raspberry Pi transmits all data back into a central system. So now you can definitely give alerts to someone who needs to refill something. They can give the customer better prediction on how big these dispensers should be. And this is like ultimately how they drive their business, because they need to compete with other soap dispensers and bathroom supply companies. It's a really interesting story. You can find it also on the internet. And that's just two examples what companies and what developers are building out there. And it's not like really straightforward or simple examples. Like we see this a lot. These are highly engaging projects. It's not something like one developer is building up, but a lot of these ideas are coming from the developers. And like with this one, for example, we put out a pilot in our developer program. A developer within the company saw this, like how we can do connectivity from a Raspberry Pi into an SAP system, and they took that one and built it out. So this is like the examples and the good stories I can show to my bosses. It's like, oh, the developer program is really helping ultimately in the sales for the company. So how do you build a developer program or an IoT developer program? So I wouldn't say we have it completely figured out. Still working on it, but there's like, I've condensed about 5 things which we saw, which is important to focus on for an IT developer program. So the first one is like, who do you target? What developer is really important for your IoT program? And the challenge here is IoT is very broad. And the developers you need to build these scenarios and to build these different IoT solutions are completely different shades of developers you have in there. It depends a lot also, like, and this is like the big differentiator, if everybody here who said like we're running IoT programs for developers, I bet there's all different, because like SAP, for example, we're not focusing on hardware. But if you're a hardware manufacturer, you probably have different goals on who you want to get for a developer to engage with your hardware. The same with like if you have more software what you build, middleware and backend software, you'd probably target a complete different IoT developer or a developer type in there. And then also like, this is like, don't ask me anything about networks. Like if you really are in these deep networks, this is like protocols, standards, wireless, like these are completely like different areas, and you need different developers. So a lot of the IoT program, and that's where I also recommend how you start, is like really defining, okay, what is it we really need to get out, and which developers do we need to target? And that's normally like when you look at your business and you look also into your products, and that's what I see as a big driver on really focusing which developers and which targets of developers you have. So also these developers you have in there are totally different. So just think about a hardware developer. It's not a developer. It's not the typical developer we know and we target all day in and out. These are not software folks. These are, normally they study electrical engineering and are really focused on building and extending the hardware devices. Also, like to understand, like these development cycles around the hardware are much, much slower than on the software. So it's really interesting. I know, like from some big partners, they're currently developing hardware for 2020. And if you ever have seen a hardware specification around these devices, it's the PDF of 500 pages and up. So this is like typically what these folks are working. Also, not to forget, there's not a lot of software understanding in the hardware device folks. They do and use software for testing, but it's not their main focus. So don't expect them that they really can interact with a software developer right away, or if they put a new device out, that this one will be already like having like all the Node.js and Java integration. This is like something which they have to spec in all the time. So that's definitely interesting when you go from the hardware developers or like towards these folks. Then we have the typical software developer. This is like probably the person we know the most. Like that person hasn't changed too much. Like it's regardless if you do middleware or if you do mobile development, they're very much like similar. But they also have certain specializations. So in software, we know that you have more the front-end developers, you have more the middleware developers, and you have more the back-end and integration developers. And that's definitely, like to find an IoT full-stack developer, if you find that one, send them to me because I want to take a picture. I have not found these guys yet. They probably exist somewhere in startups. That's where you find really smart folks, but in the general, like if you go out into the industry, they're not there. Also, big differentiation is consumer versus enterprise. Developers, either they love the consumer space so much that they stick with it, or they love the enterprise space that much. There's a back and forth. And we see this mostly when we talk with early types, like where folks have started in the consumer space and then want to bring their solution into the enterprise space, that they also keep an eye on the enterprise space. But in general, like, there's a big difference. Especially like in the enterprise space, you need to have an understanding about the business, the industry, and that's something you don't learn overnight. There's a big challenge we have. In SAP, our developers, we need to train up. It's not something I can take someone from the university and pump them directly into a logistics scenario. And then there's a third type. We definitely see more and more emerging. This is kind of like the data analyst professional. These folks are really focusing more on the data part. Typically in the old times you would have combined them with the software guys, but this is definitely, we see them more and more emerging. It's a very small group right now, and you find them mostly in the customers. So less in the partner or ISV or SI ecosystem, the customers, the corporations, they grab them. Just do a job search, and then you find these profiles, and they do, for example, I saw one last week, was from Disney, like how to optimize with IoT the park visitor behavior. Because they want to know exactly how to get more money out of you, and like if they can figure out where the people are going and why they're going, that's exactly. Like they normally also stay very long with these companies because they build up a certain domain expertise in there. The other thing is they're not really, they can use software, but they prefer much more like data crunching. They have certain tools like R and so on, or use like front-end tools for that matter. So these are the three types, and like one thing is also, you need to support these developers through the transition. Like now, if you take the 3 types we had before, IoT definitely forces a certain transformation or transition on them. Reason for that is, like all of these things, if you look at it individually, like networking, data, front-end, connectivity, that all exists in a developer/hardware engineering life before, but now you really need to work it across the boundaries. And that's normally also where you need to start with your software developers or with the different developer targets you're going to really educate them on IoT. So one thing, and it's the typical like use cases, samples, that's how we do this. Because there's a lot of like things around industries where you need to learn them out. So these are like just 3 posts I took from our community network. The first one is around predictive maintenance. How many of you know what predictive maintenance is? Oh, yeah, 3, 4 guys. Gals. So that's the thing, is like a lot of developers don't know. Predictive maintenance is basically you have a machine somewhere sitting and you figure out when I need to send next time an engineer out to fix it or get an early alert or exchange that machine because you want to reduce the maintenance costs on this one. So this is like really examples how we help the developer community. This is what customers are looking, this is how you build it. And then really tie it to your software, to your offering. Like for us, it's software and predictive, and that's where we put it together. Or other things, it's like really like where we also play around a little bit, that developers understand the connectivity aspect, and that's where you can do like very simple things, like okay, get your Raspberry Pi out and connect it into our database and into our data management tools, and let me show you how you can really work on that one. Another one, and this is something we'll definitely want to invest a little bit more on our side, is one thing we realized over time doing all the IoT stuff, that we figured out there's certain patterns. And they can be technical patterns. So this is like you get certain information in, and then you do analysis, and then you do, for example, predictive analysis on it, and then you can make certain recommendations and automate this. So this is like just an area where we also, and this comes more from also from the business side, that's where we're starting on like, okay, these are the scenarios we see in IoT. So let's focus on this. Let's build the developers up, like teach them what is predictive maintenance, what is connected car, like what are the typical scenarios around the connected car. What is about connected cities? What can you do? And it's like either customer examples, but then also the technical examples below it. So that's definitely like one thing is we want to do a little bit more because like we see a good pickup by the scenarios. And then you also find the developers within the community who are like gravitating around it and start the discussions. And then another thing is we have our developers do. So you need to be very careful because everybody loves the hardware part, but like only do something with the hardware for the developers who really need it. So like hardware, where is it needed? So definitely if you're a manufacturer and you need to do extensions on the hardware, then it becomes important. Like it could be OS extensions. We, for example, have one tiny database we can push on these different hardware devices, and that's where it becomes important. Another one is like if you really run your applications on the device or on the hardware itself. If you just read the sensor, then it's purely communication and connectivity, but you might not really run something. So that's also like you need to think like what are you really doing on the hardware. And then finally, it's like the connecting to it. That's the easiest part. Like then to really provide the developers the ways how they get certain information in and out from the device. But there's also one more, and that's why the hardware comes often back, and also for us is developers often use the hardware to simulate some IoT scenarios. So this one is a picture of a keynote we did around, and one of the things was IoT in there, and it's cranes. This is actually a small crane, And it's a scenario where through IoT, we figure out that cranes cannot collide if you have multiple cranes on a different area or standing in a different area. So for a keynote, one hint also, never put a crane on the keynote stage. You learn a lot about insurance, you learn a lot about statistics. Like it was a nightmare to just put 2 cranes on there. But like what's interesting on these cranes, like you see a little sensor up here, and there's sensors on the ground, and they know exactly where the crane is moving. And by now combining all these algorithms, we could like say like, okay, if the cranes come too close, they stop automatically, so you interfere there. These cranes are really expensive for any developer. They would love to play with that stuff. But like, you can find a simple and cheap solution. So we went to a toy store and got some cranes. They cost $20. And we put exactly the same sensors on there. And that's how we simulate it. So it's also like interesting, you can use the hardware to simulate these big things on a smaller scale. So enablement is my next one, which is actually a really, really complex topic. Enablement of developers. And now you have seen it from the breadth of the IoT scenarios. Because you have the hardware, you have the data, you have the connectivity, it really becomes a hard thing for your developers to get started. One thing is, with the hardware, like in some cases you really need to provide the hardware, or at least provide guidelines where they can get the access to the hardware. And then also to think about it, this is an event we did 2 weeks ago in Bangalore. $35 Raspberry Pi is pretty expensive in Bangalore. So don't assume that your developers have immediately access or that they all have a Raspberry Pi and the hardware at home. So we do a lot. We have our team going out with gigantic suitcases to each of these events. And developers are really great folks. We mostly get all of them back after the event. But it's very important like, to get them started. And you need to bring them somehow into the thinking. And yes, the hardware part helps you to get it a little, or make it a little bit more exciting. And that's where we're using it. And then another thing, and that's definitely an area we need to do more in general, like is data and also simulations. So now you think about it, you have the hardware. In some cases, you cannot really build it always for your software engineers. So in this example, we have, for example, streaming data use cases. So we built this into our products. So instead of like really waiting for the data from a sensor to come in, we also have streaming simulations. And so the target is also for us to put this online, so every developer can connect to these streaming data sources and really test it out. So this one is just like, I think it's a sensor information around temperature, but that's also like, that makes it much easier for any software developer who does not want to deal with the hardware. And don't be surprised, there's a lot of software developers, if they do try around for 2 days around breadboards, they're like, okay, I'm done with this, I'm not going there. Like they really want to stay in the software world, but there's like through simulation you can do a lot of things. And then finally, like one thing, also what we are really focusing on, definitely in the IoT space, you can't do it alone. Like SAP is gigantic, we have 70,000 employees, we have 22,000 engineers in our company, but we focus in IoT a lot on partnering and also like partnering with the different areas where we don't have the domain expertise and expanding it on. So ways how we do this is we run very open developer engagements and developer events. So we did, for example, last year here one in Palo Alto. It's called IoT at Scale, which goes exactly into this business type IoT scenarios, where we partnered up with about 15 different partners in the space to really build out the common understanding. And we're partners from the networking side, Cisco, we had partners from startups, from hardware vendors, really all get together and explore what is possible around IoT. Great thing is also we have more detailed follow-up, of course, with these partners and build out great relations with them. And this is also what we do then back to the community. So we recommend certain partners in the networking space, in the hardware space, to our developers. And this is like, for example, just two things where we really built this out. So when we discuss this with partners, the first thing is there needs to be a very good understanding what's the joint goals. Like what's the joint goals and what is each partner's goal. So for us, this is exactly where like, okay, SAP is here. This is what we want for our developer community to build up. You're, for example, in the hardware space, we can help you. Because like we can get you the software developers who potentially then make the recommendation for the hardware. So these goals need to be very clear and then really can create great results. And the other thing is it's also like, yeah, you need to really embed this into your documentation, tutorials, samples. So it's not longer that you just like, here's how I do it with our technology. Now here's like also like how you go over to the partner or to the other developer evangelists and they write a blog, how they integrate with SAP, for example. So this works really nice and also like it brings an interesting new mix of developers together. Like you also we invite them to events, like our big events. They have booths, showcases directly on our show floor. We're using their stuff, and that really like is also what we communicate out to the developer community. With that, like it sounds, IoT is probably like a big new thing, but this was in a presentation James Gosselin, the godfather of Java, said once, it feels like I'm doing the Internet of Things for decades. That was last year. In a nutshell, IoT, if you look at it, it's not a lot of new stuff. You had the hardware, you had the connectivity, and a lot of developers know that stuff. You had the middleware piece, and you had also like about data storage and like how to handle the data in the past. What has changed a lot is now you basically have the real-time aspect in the whole thing. So like in the past, you could get sensor data from your airplane, but only when it was landed and after 5 weeks, and maybe the airline industry was never really looking at the data. Nowadays, you can get more and more of this data online. You can get this from your truck, you can get this from your consumer. So one thing is the real-time aspect. If I want to know something now, I can get this. That's one. And the other one is the sheer amount of data. Like when we talk to a lot of customers, they're like, oh, we have this data. We never used it. We dumped it. We never even archived the data. So now the technology, and that's I think the big one in IoT, it enables us to really make use of the data and really make use for the developers to go deeper on the data. So the core things, in a nutshell, it is the same. You just really need to work on the real time and on understanding of the data. It's also like the event, I will post the slides later on SlideShare, which brings me already to end. So I don't know how many minutes we have left for questions. Oh, I get a shake. They're like, no. So I will post the slides on SlideShare. So thank you. And then also like if you're interested, also want to extend it here. If you have some interesting scenarios from a developer program where you feel like, okay, I should talk with SAP, I'm definitely interested to connect with you here, or also find me online to discuss more. Thank you.